Once in Royal David City stood a lowly cattle shed. Well, good morning. Happy Sunday. I hope you're doing very well indeed. And welcome to the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand. A place that I'm actually quite familiar with because when I used to work in law, occasionally I had a case that was big enough to merit coming to this building. Once in Royal David City. But was it once in Royal David City? That's the carol we sing. That carol tells the story of the extraordinary birth of Jesus. But is it true? Once in Royal David City, or maybe never in Royal David City? I've come today to the Royal Courts because here is a place where evidence matters. If you've watched some of these other videos, you'll perhaps be thinking, well, okay, Will's been trying to persuade us that it works, the Christian faith, but what about whether it's actually true or not? Today, we don't care hugely about claims of truth. We just care about things working or not working. And I want to tell you, as I've said over the weeks, that Christianity definitely does work. But it's extremely important, in fact crucial, to also think about whether it is true. Is the story that we're going to be remembering in a few weeks' time, indeed, is the record of the Bible true? Or is it just a nice lot of myths and made-up fables that people have come to believe in over the years? Of course, this building behind me is a place where the truth matters supremely. That is the purpose. One of the purposes of this building is to bring your evidence into a courtroom, for that evidence to be weighed and tested, and for the judge to give his or her verdict. Jesus said famously, "If you are really my disciples, you will do what I say, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Extraordinary claim that Christ makes, that if you follow him, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus also said, also in John's Gospel, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So what Jesus is claiming there is that he is the truth. He is, if you like, the plumb line. He is the basis upon which all of life, your life, my life, the world, has to orbit. An extraordinary, an outrageous claim, really, unless it is true. So this morning I want to think with you about the truth of the Christian faith. So important to have faith in something. It's so important to know the truth of the thing that I am calling you to have faith in, or have more faith in. So let's look at some of the evidence this morning. Firstly, what about the writers themselves? I'm thinking mainly of the New Testament for the purposes of this morning's sermon. What do the writers themselves claim about the truth of what they are saying? Well, let's take Luke's Gospel. If you were to open Luke's Gospel and turn to the first chapter, at the very, very beginning, Luke says, "I'm writing to you to establish the truth, the certainty of your faith." Let me just read a few words from Luke himself. Luke, a doctor, so not a man who somehow wasn't professional, a professional man who knew about being a doctor. And he decides to write this account about Jesus. And he says this, "I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." So Luke makes it very clear at the very outset that his account is an orderly account. He's investigated it as a doctor would. A doctor who needs and wants evidence. That's what Luke says. Let's take Peter. Peter, one of the key witnesses to all that he saw Jesus do. Peter, a simple fisherman. Fishermen knew about life. Not particularly clever men necessarily, but very earthly and rooted men. Peter says this in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16. He says, "For we did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." So we're not coming up with cunning plans and special stories. We simply saw what we saw, and we've written it down for you to read. That's what Peter says. And then John, who we've heard from already. John, in that famous prologue to his gospel, says this at verse 14. He says, the Word, referring to Jesus, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Friends, those people who wrote down the Christian faith, they weren't particularly clever. Some of them were quite educated. Matthew was a tax collector, Luke was a doctor, many were fishermen. But they weren't people that sat in universities pondering things forever. They were people who simply spent time with Jesus or investigated the claims that were being spoken of, as is in Luke's case, and who wrote it down for us in centuries later. So the people themselves present their evidence, and it is good and wonderful evidence. But let's think about a few other things when it comes to the truth of the Christian faith. And what I want to think about with you now is what I might call the ring of truth. Where do we find the ring of truth? Because many people won't be persuaded that those who wrote down the Christian faith were simple, truthful people. They'll want to see more evidence. A bit like coming to this court. The judge might say, well, that's good, but I want to see more evidence that what you're saying is true. So let's think about that now together. Let's think again about the disciples, 12 fairly ordinary men, presenting themselves not with great glory. If you read any of the Gospels, you'll see that again and again the disciples misunderstand Jesus. They misunderstand who he is, they misunderstand what he's doing. Now again, if you want to fabricate a religion or any story, it's quite good to paint yourself in a good light when you make that fabrication, so that people might actually come to believe it. But read about the disciples, and so often they are scratching their heads, and Jesus is saying to them, do you still not understand what's going on? So I think that helps to point to the truth of what they write. Then there are 4 Gospels. Sometimes people say, well, aren't there inconsistencies? Well, there are little inconsistencies, yes, but none of the inconsistencies make a jot of difference to the essential truth of the Christian faith. And there are 4 of them, and there are little subtle differences between them, and rather than that being some form of weakness, I would say that's a glorious strength, because they've all described things from different perspectives. If you and I witnessed a scene, and there were, say, 4 of us around witnessing that scene, we'd all probably come up with slightly different stories. Of course, stories that agreed with each other, no doubt about that, but stories from different perspectives. And that's exactly what we find in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Stories from different perspectives about this one extraordinary man, Jesus Christ. That, for me, has the ring of truth. Then, of course, there's the role of women. In Jesus' day, women had very little status indeed, and their testimony certainly wouldn't stand up in court. And yet there are many women who witness things going on in the Gospels, not least in the resurrection. It is women who play a key role in declaring that Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. And again, you don't write women into a story unless you're confident that is simply the way that it happened. So the evidence of the women. Then there are the miracles themselves. Okay, you might say Jesus could fabricate the odd miracle. He could walk on water by standing on planks under the water, that sort of thing. Okay, fine. But many of the things Jesus did couldn't be fabricated. You can't just produce 5,000 plates of food from a little bread and a few fish. That is impossible. You can't simply call people who have been dead 3 days and who are smelly, that's Lazarus, by the way, in John's Gospel. You can't call those people out of a tomb and expect to get away with it. And of course, the greatest miracle, and the miracle upon which the Christian faith stands or falls, is Christ's resurrection. That's the essence of the evidence for the miracles is really bound up in that moment. If Jesus simply dies and doesn't rise, then really everything he said about himself is fraudulent, because that's the one thing he said he was going to do to prove to everybody that he was the Son of God. And the evidence for his resurrection is very, very compelling indeed. So again, the ring of truth. It has the ring of truth about it. What about the fulfillment of prophecy, finally? Okay, Jesus fulfills tons of prophecy that comes out of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Okay, you might say, well, he deliberately set about to fulfill that. Okay, maybe. but you can't decide where you're going to be born. And it was clearly prophesied that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. And we know how that took place. That took place because Caesar issued that decree that all people must return to their hometowns. Now, again, all that happened, and as it then happened, Jesus was born in that place. Very, very hard indeed, if not impossible, to fabricate where you're, or to decide and manipulate where you're going to be born. So friends, I hope those things help you to see that within the Christian faith there is what I would call the ring of truth. I didn't become a Christian with a legal training. I came to Christ simply because there was a moment in my life when I understood that I needed the forgiveness of sins, and this man was offering it to me freely without any strings attached. That's how I came to become a Christian. But then when I became a lawyer, I started being more interested in the evidence for the Christian faith. And as I've looked into it more, and also with a legal training, I've realized that there is no contradiction at all between being a lawyer and being a Christian, because the evidence for Jesus in the New Testament is overwhelming. Lee Strobel wrote a wonderful book in 1998. Commend you to get a copy if you've never read it, called The Case for Christ. Fascinating man. He decided that he was going to investigate the claims of Jesus because his wife became a Christian and he didn't like it very much, and he thought, I'm going to go and disprove this faith. Well, he comes out believing in it and writing a book about it. He himself is a journalist. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And in that book he says many things, but let me just quote one of the things he says. He says this: I became a Christian because the evidence was so compelling that Jesus really is the one and only Son of God, who proved his divinity by rising from the dead. That meant following him was the most rational and logical step I could possibly take. There are some people watching this who want it to be rational and logical. Well, friends, you don't need to stop being rational and logical to follow Jesus Christ. There is very good and compelling evidence that if I brought it to this court and presented it to a judge, that evidence would stack up in court. In fact, the evidence in the New Testament is so good and powerful, it's almost embarrassingly good. And we Christians need to be confident in what we're believing in. It's not just a feeling, our faith. It doesn't just work, although both those things are true. What we're believing in is good historical evidence that would stack up in court. This place, a place where you bring your evidence, but this place is also a place where you get your verdict. You present your evidence and the judge decides on the basis of the evidence what the judgment should be. Friends, Christianity also works like that. On the basis of the evidence that is presented in the Bible, the verdict is issued. And the verdict of the Bible is very clear. The verdict of the Bible is Jesus is the Son of God. He is the truth. And insofar as we're out of kilter with that truth, we're in trouble. Because he is the plumb line. He is the center around which we must orbit. And so the verdict of Jesus is, if you're out of line with me, you're out of line. Some people think they're too bad for God. Well, they're wrong, because Jesus, the truth, says nobody is too bad for me. Some people think they're too good for God. Well, they're out of kilter, because people who say they are too good for God are wrong. God says, no, you need my salvation. You need my forgiveness. You will not make it into the next life until you receive the present, the salvation that I have to offer you. Jesus says, I am that plumb line. I am the truth. And that is the verdict that Jesus issues to us, indeed, to the world. Let me quote C.S. Lewis again, because he puts things so wonderfully and so clearly. He says this: Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. Friends, this is life or death stuff. This is infinitely important. Jesus is the truth. He is the way to God. And he comes to the world and he's born in a stable, and he lives a perfect life, and he dies on a cross, and he rises to new life, and all that is beyond doubt as evidence. And the verdict he then makes and issues to the world is, you need me. You're not going to get through life, and certainly not through death, without me. I'm here. I'm here for you. Friends, the invitation in that carol, once in royal David City, it goes on to say, he came down to earth from heaven. Friends, he's here. He's presented his case. And the question for us is to believe in it, to rejoice in it, and to live in light of his truth. Our lives are meant to orbit around this truth. And that, friends, is the way to have freedom, to be set free from all the lies in the world, to find the truth that is indeed in Jesus Christ. May God bless you this Sunday.